Margaret had always thought of herself as someone who had done a good job taking care of her health. As a woman in her 70s, she felt fortunate to have lived a relatively active life. In her younger years, Margaret was never one to shy away from exercise. She had been a runner, a yoga enthusiast, and even participated in her local tennis league. Even after getting married, raising two children, and managing a busy career as a schoolteacher, she had found time for herself, always keeping up with some form of physical activity. Life had been good to her until her 70th birthday. Turning 70 was a milestone, and for Margaret, it felt like a turning point in ways she hadn't expected. The day before her birthday, she had visited her doctor for her routine checkup. Margaret had grown accustomed to her annual visits, but this one felt different. There had been subtle signs in the months leading up to this appointment. A bit of shortness of breath after climbing the stairs, more frequent fatigue, and perhaps a few more aches and pains than she was used to. But, as she had done many times before, she attributed these changes to the natural aging process. Her thoughts were that this was just what getting older looked like, nothing to worry about. When the doctor entered the room, she greeted Margaret warmly, as always. Dr. Simmons had been her physician for years, and they had developed a rapport over time. However, there was something in Dr. Simmons' expression that Margaret hadn't seen before. A slight frown, a look of concern, something that made Margaret's chest tighten. The doctor reviewed Margaret's lab results and then looked up with a solemn expression. "Margaret," Dr. Simmons began, "there are a few things we need to talk about today." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She had never been one to panic easily, but the way her doctor was speaking made her uneasy. Dr. Simmons continued, explaining that Margaret's blood pressure was high. She had elevated cholesterol levels, and, more concerning, her blood sugar levels were creeping into the pre-diabetic range. These were all factors that, if left unaddressed, could lead to significant health complications in the near future. The doctor also mentioned that Margaret had gained some weight over the past few years, which, combined with her family history of diabetes and heart disease, put her at a higher risk for cardiovascular issues. Margaret sat there in silence for a moment, absorbing the news. She had expected the usual "you're doing fine," or maybe "let's keep an eye on things," but this was different. Her doctor's tone had been serious, almost as if she was warning her of something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. "What do you think I should do?" Margaret finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Simmons paused for a moment, then looked directly at Margaret and said, "I think you need to make some changes, significant changes. It's not too late, but the sooner you act, the better." The conversation continued with Dr. Simmons providing a list of recommendations. She suggested that Margaret start monitoring her blood pressure regularly, improve her diet, and, most importantly, become more physically active. She also recommended that Margaret follow up with a nutritionist to learn more about how food could play a role in reversing the early signs of diabetes and hypertension. Margaret nodded along, trying to absorb the information, but inside, a sense of dread was settling in. After the appointment, Margaret left the doctor's office feeling numb. As she walked to her car, she replayed the conversation in her mind over and over again. How had things gotten so bad? She had always considered herself healthy, but now it seemed like her body was betraying her. She had always been proud of how active she was compared to her peers. She had no family history of serious illness. Her parents had both lived well into their 90s, maintaining a relatively active lifestyle. She had assumed that she too would continue to enjoy good health well into her later years. But now, it felt as though that future was slipping away from her. Sitting in the driver's seat of her car, Margaret allowed herself a few moments to gather her thoughts. She knew deep down that her lifestyle had changed over the years. She had retired from teaching 5 years ago, and since then, her days had become more sedentary. The daily walks she used to take around her neighborhood had become less frequent. She had traded in her tennis racket for a good book and a cup of tea. Meals had become less balanced, with more takeout or frozen dinners than she liked to admit. And although she still tried to stay active by gardening or doing a bit of yoga at home, it wasn't the same. The reality was that she had been neglecting her health, and now she was paying the price. The drive home felt longer than usual as Margaret mulled over everything. She knew she couldn't ignore the doctor's advice. If she wanted to feel better, to feel like herself again, she would have to make changes. But where would she start? Margaret had never been one for drastic changes, preferring to ease into new routines gradually. She needed a plan, something manageable that wouldn't overwhelm her. That evening, as Margaret sat in her living room, she began to reflect on her life. She had always been proud of her independence, and the thought of relying on medications or experiencing the kind of health issues her doctor had warned her about filled her with fear. She realized that the road ahead depended on what she did right now. Margaret had always been the type to take action when faced with a challenge, and this was no different. She couldn't afford to sit idly by while her health deteriorated. The next morning, after a restless night of thinking, Margaret decided to take the first step. She called her doctor's office to schedule an appointment with a nutritionist. The idea of changing her diet felt daunting, but she knew it was essential. It was time to learn how to take control of her health and her future. Then, she went for a walk around her neighborhood, a small but meaningful gesture. Her knees ached as she made her way down the familiar streets, but she reminded herself that this was just the beginning. Margaret also reached out to a friend, someone who had always been an inspiration to her when it came to staying active. Helen, who was a few years older than Margaret, had taken up swimming and had become an advocate for senior fitness. Helen had always been enthusiastic about life, and Margaret knew that if anyone could help her, it was Helen. They made plans to meet for coffee later that week, and Margaret began to feel a spark of hope. Perhaps this wasn't the end of her health story, but the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like she was taking control of her health. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would likely be setbacks, but she had a plan. More importantly, she had the determination to make it work. Her body may have been sending her signals that she couldn't ignore, but now, with the right knowledge and commitment, Margaret was ready to listen and make the changes necessary to ensure that her 70s and beyond could be filled with vitality, not sickness. She had a lot of life left to live, and she was going to do whatever it took to ensure she could live it fully. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a transformation that would not only improve her physical health, but would also revitalize her spirit and outlook on life. The first decision Margaret made after her visit to the doctor was to commit herself to physical activity. The advice had been clear: she needed to get moving. It wasn't as if she had been completely inactive before. After all, she had enjoyed long walks in the past and had spent years teaching, which kept her on her feet for most of the day. However, it was the consistency and intensity that she now realized she was lacking. There had been a subtle shift in her lifestyle over the years, one that she hadn't fully acknowledged until her recent wake-up call. Her walks had become more sporadic, her gardening sessions had grown shorter, and her yoga practice had faded into distant memory. The day after her doctor's appointment, Margaret decided to start her journey by revisiting her old habit of walking. She pulled on her sneakers, grabbed her jacket, and stepped out into the cool morning air. Her neighborhood was peaceful at that hour, the streets quiet and still, with only the soft chirp of birds to accompany her thoughts. As she began to walk, Margaret felt a faint sense of accomplishment, but she was also aware of how stiff her legs felt. The last time she had walked for more than a mile was months ago, and it showed. Her knees ached, her breathing was slightly labored, and she found herself taking more breaks than she would have liked. It was a frustrating feeling, to be honest. Margaret had always prided herself on her strength and endurance, but here she was, struggling to walk even a short distance. She had to stop twice before completing the full loop of her neighborhood. The sense of accomplishment she had expected to feel was replaced by a wave of self-doubt. Was this really going to help her get back in shape? Would she ever be able to return to the active lifestyle she had once enjoyed? But as she walked back to her front door, she reminded herself of the importance of starting small. Her doctor had warned her that gradual changes were key to long-term success. As disheartening as the experience had been, Margaret knew that it wasn't about perfection. It was about making the effort, taking one step at a time, and staying committed. She wasn't going to let a little discomfort derail her goals. The following days were no easier. Her joints continued to protest, and every morning it felt like she was starting from scratch. But Margaret persisted. She made a deal with herself. If she could walk every day for at least 20 minutes, even if it wasn't easy, she would consider it a success. It wasn't much, but it was something. Each day she walked a little farther. Her muscles grew slightly stronger, and her breath came a bit easier. There were still mornings when she doubted whether this would truly make a difference, but she pressed on. About 2 weeks into her new routine, Margaret began to notice subtle changes. She no longer felt completely exhausted after her walks. The stiffness in her knees, while still present, had lessened. Most importantly, Margaret felt a shift in her mindset. She wasn't just walking to improve her health anymore. She was walking because it made her feel better physically and emotionally. The routine of getting outside and moving had become a form of self-care, a way to take control of her health and her future. It was around this time that Margaret's friend, Helen, called to check in on her. Margaret had mentioned her decision to start walking during their last conversation, and Helen was eager to hear how it was going. Margaret explained her struggles, but also her small victories. Helen, ever the optimist, encouraged her to keep going, sharing that she had taken up swimming herself. "You know, swimming is great for the joints," Helen said. "The water supports your body, and it's low impact. You should give it a try sometime." Margaret hadn't swum in years, but the idea intrigued her. She knew that water-based exercise would be gentle on her aging joints, so she decided to give it a try. The next day, she visited the local community center, which had an indoor pool. She wasn't expecting to be great at it right away, but she figured it couldn't hurt to try. The first day in the pool was humbling. Margaret struggled to find her rhythm, and she was quickly reminded of how out of practice she was. But there was something invigorating about being in the water. The coolness, the weightlessness, the freedom to move without the pressure on her joints. After a few laps, she could feel the tension in her body start to melt away. The next day, she returned for another swim, and then again the following day. Swimming became a wonderful complement to her walking routine. The water provided a sense of relief for her sore knees and allowed her to get her heart rate up without the fear of injury. Margaret soon found herself looking forward to her time at the pool. Her energy levels began to improve, and she was feeling more capable than she had in months. Her stamina was increasing, and she was beginning to feel like she could do more than just walk around her neighborhood. By the time Margaret had been walking and swimming for a month, she had a new perspective on movement. It wasn't just about hitting a certain target or number of steps. It was about showing up every day, even when it was difficult. It was about listening to her body and honoring its needs. On some days, that meant taking a rest day or shortening her walk. On others, it meant pushing herself a little farther than she had the day before. The key, Margaret realized, was consistency. If she kept moving, kept making the effort, the results would come. As she continued with her routine, Margaret noticed that her blood pressure had begun to drop. She had been monitoring it at home with the blood pressure cuff her doctor had recommended, and the numbers were improving. She had also lost a few pounds, something she hadn't expected. The weight loss wasn't drastic, but it was a start. More importantly, Margaret felt better in her own skin. The aches and pains that had once seemed permanent were slowly dissipating, and she was able to move with greater ease. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months into her new regimen, Margaret decided to take a walk to the park. It was a beautiful spring day, and the park was bustling with families, children running and playing, and older adults walking or sitting on benches, enjoying the sunshine. Margaret walked along the path, taking in the sights and sound around her. For the first time in a long while, she felt fully alive, connected to the world around her. As she reached the end of the park, Margaret stopped to catch her breath. She looked around, smiling at how much progress she had made. Not just physically, but emotionally. The commitment she had made to her health had transformed her sense of well-being. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She realized she was doing it for the life she wanted to lead in the years to come. Movement was no longer a chore. It had become a source of joy and empowerment. Helen called that evening to check in, and Margaret couldn't help but share her excitement. "I feel so good," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never thought I'd feel this way again." It's amazing what just moving every day can do. Helen laughed warmly. I knew you'd get there, Margaret. Keep going, and don't forget to enjoy the journey. You got this. And Margaret did have it. Her commitment to physical movement, starting with walking and eventually adding swimming, had become the cornerstone of her newfound vitality. She wasn't just moving her body anymore. She was moving toward a future where she felt strong, capable, and in control. The first habit was in place, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose and optimism about the years ahead. Margaret had always considered herself someone who ate reasonably well. She enjoyed home-cooked meals, had a fondness for vegetables, and believed in moderation. However, the more she reflected on her recent visit to the doctor, the more she realized that her idea of eating well had become more of a distant memory than a reality. Sure, she cooked occasionally, but there were too many nights when she opted for takeout, frozen dinners, or whatever was quick and easy. Over time, her once nutritious meals had become heavier and less balanced, filled with more carbohydrates and processed foods than she cared to admit. It was no surprise, then, that her blood sugar levels had crept into the pre-diabetic range, and her doctor had strongly advised that she reevaluate her diet. The turning point came a few days after her doctor's appointment, when Margaret finally decided to take action. She called the nutritionist that Dr. Simmons had recommended. The appointment was set for the following week, and Margaret felt both anxious and hopeful. She had never worked with a nutritionist before, and the idea of overhauling her eating habits was intimidating. But Margaret was determined. If she could commit to walking and swimming regularly, she could certainly make a few changes to her diet. She had to. Her health was at stake. When Margaret arrived at the nutritionist's office, she was greeted by a warm and welcoming woman named Emily. Emily had a calm, reassuring presence that immediately put Margaret at ease. As Margaret explained her situation, her recent diagnosis, her desire to feel better, and her commitment to becoming healthier, Emily listened intently. Margaret's hesitation was clear, though. She had never been one for extreme dieting or restrictive food plans. Emily sensed this and smiled gently. I'm not here to put you on a diet, Margaret. What I want to do is help you understand how food can work for you, not against you. We'll focus on balance, not restriction. Margaret nodded, relieved. That was exactly what she needed to hear. She wasn't looking for a quick fix or a drastic change that would leave her feeling deprived. She wanted a sustainable, long-term approach, something that would fit into her life and that she could maintain for years to come. The session began with Emily taking a thorough look at Margaret's current eating habits. Emily asked Margaret to list everything she typically ate in a day, from breakfast to dinner, snacks included. Margaret hesitated at first, but as she began to list out her meals, she could see the pattern emerging. Breakfast was often a bowl of cereal, followed by coffee with a generous amount of sugar. Lunch was usually a sandwich or a salad with a dressing that was loaded with calories. Dinner was where things became more irregular. Some nights, she cooked a homemade meal, but many nights, especially after a long day of swimming or walking, she would choose something quick and convenient, like a frozen pizza or takeout. Snacks were another issue. Margaret was prone to indulging in cookies, chips, or whatever was within arm's reach when she felt a bit hungry. It was clear that her eating habits, while not terrible, could use some improvement. Emily smiled as she reviewed the list. You're not alone, Margaret. Most people fall into the same patterns without even realizing it. The key here is understanding what your body needs and how to fuel it properly. We'll start by focusing on the basics, balancing your macronutrients, protein, healthy fats, and carbohydrates at each meal and snack. The conversation then shifted to what Margaret could do immediately. Emily recommended that she begin with a simple shift, cutting back on processed foods, especially refined sugars and carbohydrates, while increasing the intake of lean proteins, healthy fats, and fiber-rich vegetables. She also emphasized the importance of eating regular meals, no skipping breakfast or lunch, and having snacks that were both satisfying and nutritious. Emily outlined a basic plan for Margaret, one that didn't require any special ingredients or complicated recipes. We're not talking about perfection here, Emily said. It's about making small, sustainable changes that will improve your overall health. You don't have to cut out everything you love, but you'll want to be mindful of what you're eating and how it makes you feel. The advice resonated deeply with Margaret. She had always been someone who believed in moderation, but had never fully understood how balanced meals could have such a profound impact on her health. Emily's approach made sense. It was practical, realistic, and most importantly, sustainable. The first step was to focus on incorporating more vegetables into her meals. Margaret had always liked vegetables, but she realized that over time, they had become more of an afterthought than the star of the plate. Emily suggested that Margaret start by aiming for a variety of colorful vegetables at every meal, which would help her get a broad range of nutrients. She also recommended healthy fats like olive oil, avocado, and nuts, which could help keep her feeling full and satisfied. Lean proteins, such as chicken, fish, tofu, and legumes, were another priority, as they would help stabilize her blood sugar and keep her energy levels steady throughout the day. Lastly, Emily encouraged Margaret to reduce her reliance on processed grains like white bread and pasta, and instead opt for whole grains like quinoa, brown rice, and oats, which were higher in fiber and had a more gentle effect on blood sugar levels. Emily also explained the importance of hydration. Margaret had always enjoyed tea and coffee, but she hadn't been as diligent about drinking water. Emily recommended that Margaret aim for at least 8 glasses of water a day, and encouraged her to drink a glass of water before each meal. This simple habit, she explained, could help with digestion, reduce hunger cravings, and improve her overall well-being. With the guidance of her nutritionist, Margaret left the appointment feeling empowered and motivated to make some real changes. The plan was clear, and the steps felt manageable. Margaret wasn't sure if she could completely overhaul her diet overnight, but she felt confident that if she took it one meal at a time, she could make the transition without feeling overwhelmed. The first week of her new eating habits was harder than Margaret had anticipated. She had grown accustomed to the ease of processed foods, and it took extra effort to cook meals from scratch. Breakfast, for instance, was a challenge. She had always grabbed something quick, but now she started preparing oatmeal with fresh fruit or scrambled eggs with spinach and avocado. It wasn't always perfect. There were days when she found herself reaching for a snack that wasn't quite as healthy as it should have been, but Margaret was determined to stay on track. By the second week, Margaret had settled into a rhythm. She found that her meals were more satisfying, and her energy levels were more consistent throughout the day. She didn't feel the same mid-afternoon slump that she had grown used to, and her cravings for sugary snacks were becoming less frequent. Her portion sizes had naturally decreased as well, as she began to realize that the rich, balanced meals she was eating were more filling than her previous quick fixes. Margaret also noticed a shift in her attitude toward food. No longer was she focused on what she couldn't have. She was learning to appreciate the food that nourished her body. The vibrant colors of fresh vegetables, the heartiness of whole grains, and the richness of healthy fats began to feel indulgent in their own right. There was a satisfaction in knowing that each meal was helping her feel better and take better care of herself. By the time a month had passed, Margaret had begun to feel lighter, both physically and mentally. Her clothes were fitting better, and she had lost a few pounds, though she wasn't keeping track of a number on the scale. More importantly, her blood sugar levels had started to stabilize, and her energy was more consistent. Margaret noticed that she no longer felt the same fatigue after meals. She could swim longer, walk farther, and generally felt more capable throughout the day. In addition to the physical changes, Margaret's emotional state had also improved. She no longer felt like food was something to be feared or avoided. She had developed a healthier relationship with eating, one where she felt in control, not deprived. She learned that eating well didn't mean giving up the food she loved. It simply meant finding balance and making mindful choices. As Margaret's understanding of food deepened, she also began to experiment with new recipes and cooking techniques. She found joy in preparing meals that were not only nutritious, but also flavorful and satisfying. It was no longer just about sustenance. It was about pleasure and self-care. Margaret had become more attuned to how food made her feel, and that awareness had created a lasting shift in her habits. One evening, As she sat down to a colorful plate of grilled salmon, quinoa, and a side of roasted vegetables, Margaret realized how far she had come. The changes she had made to her diet weren't just helping her feel better physically. They were giving her a sense of empowerment. She was taking control of her health, one meal at a time. The future no longer seemed uncertain or full of limitations. With each step, she was reclaiming her vitality and her confidence. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt truly nourished, not just in body, but in spirit as well. By the time Margaret had settled into her new routine of regular physical activity and a balanced diet, she felt better than she had in years. Her energy levels were on the rise, and she was becoming more confident in her ability to take charge of her health. There was, however, one essential component of wellness that Margaret had yet to fully embrace: rest. For the longest time, Margaret had viewed rest as an indulgence, something to be done only when absolutely necessary. It was an afterthought, never a priority. But as the months passed and her lifestyle began to transform, she came to realize that rest, both physical and mental, was just as crucial to her long-term well-being as the exercise and healthy eating habits she had worked so hard to implement. It all started with one simple observation. Margaret had been feeling more fatigued than usual, despite sticking to her exercise routine and eating a healthier diet. She was sleeping well enough at night, but she couldn't help but notice that even after her usual swim or walk, her muscles were still sore, and her energy didn't seem to bounce back the way it used to. At first, she chalked it up to overexertion, but after a while, she started to question whether something else was going on. One morning, as she stretched after a swim, Margaret called her daughter, Amy, to chat. Amy had been encouraging her mother to take it easy, to remember that at 70, rest was just as important as exercise. "Mom, I know you feel great, but you've been pushing yourself pretty hard. Have you been taking enough time to rest and recover?" Margaret felt a little defensive. "I've been sticking to my routine, Amy. I'm feeling good, just a little sore sometimes." Amy, who had a background in physical therapy, gently reminded her that recovery wasn't just about resting after a tough workout. It was about giving the body the time and space it needed to repair itself, to recharge, and to prevent injury. "You might need more rest than you think," she said. "It's not just about the exercise, it's about allowing your muscles to heal and your body to recover so you can continue progressing." Margaret hadn't given it much thought before, but Amy's words stuck with her. That afternoon, she decided to do some research. She read articles, watched videos, and spoke to a few fitness experts about the importance of rest and recovery, especially for people in their 70s. What she learned opened her eyes. Rest was not a luxury. It was a necessity for optimal health. The body, especially as it ages, requires time to rebuild itself after physical activity. Overtraining without proper recovery could lead to injury, burnout, and even setbacks in progress. What she found most surprising was the fact that the body didn't just repair itself physically during rest. It also rejuvenated mentally and emotionally. A well-rested body led to better cognitive function, improved mood, and reduced stress levels. Sleep, in particular, played a vital role in the body's ability to heal and regenerate cells. Margaret realized that despite her efforts in physical activity and nutrition, she had been neglecting this crucial part of the equation. Determined to make changes, Margaret set out to incorporate more rest into her routine. She started by focusing on two key areas: sleep and active recovery. She made a conscious decision to prioritize her sleep by ensuring that she was getting at least 7 to 8 hours each night. She made her bedroom more conducive to rest by eliminating distractions like her phone and television. She also started winding down earlier, practicing relaxation techniques like deep breathing and light stretching before bed. These changes helped her sleep more deeply and wake up feeling more refreshed. Her morning routine shifted slightly as well. Instead of immediately jumping into a workout, she spent a few minutes meditating or practicing mindfulness, giving her body and mind a peaceful start to the day. In addition to improving her sleep, Margaret began to incorporate more active recovery into her weekly schedule. She started taking rest days between her more intense physical activities, choosing to engage in lighter forms of exercise like walking at a slower pace or doing yoga. These activities allowed her to keep moving without overloading her muscles. Margaret discovered that gentle yoga, with its emphasis on stretching and relaxation, helped relieve the soreness in her body while also improving her flexibility and mobility. She also enjoyed spending time in nature, taking slow walks through the park or her neighborhood, soaking in the sights and sound around her. These restful movements, combined with her focus on sleep, began to have a profound effect on her overall well-being. One evening, about 2 months into this new routine, Margaret realized how much of a difference it had made. She was sitting on her porch, sipping a cup of chamomile tea and watching the sunset. She noticed that the tension that had once held her body captive, the stiff muscles, the aching joints, the constant fatigue, was slowly melting away. Her body felt more balanced, her mind clearer, and her emotions steadier. She could tell that her commitment to rest and recovery was paying off, and the changes were not just physical, they were also mental and emotional. Margaret had found a new sense of peace in this phase of life, one that involved both action and stillness, movement and rest. Her relationship with rest had evolved from something she saw as a weakness or a luxury to something she now viewed as a vital part of a healthy lifestyle. It wasn't just about avoiding overexertion, it was about respecting her body's need for balance, honoring her limits, and trusting that recovery was just as important as the work itself. She had learned to listen to her body and respond with kindness and care, which had made all the difference in how she felt on a daily basis. The benefits of rest and recovery were not just physical. Margaret found that she was more mentally sharp, more patient, and less irritable. She had always been someone who prided herself on her independence and energy, but she had often ignored the subtle signs of burnout. Now, she was beginning to embrace the idea that taking time for herself, without guilt, was not only necessary but empowering. She wasn't surrendering to aging. She was adapting to it, and in doing so, she was becoming stronger than ever before. As the months went by, Margaret's routine of balanced exercise, mindful eating, and adequate rest became second nature. Her friends noticed the changes too. Helen, who had also been on her own health journey, marveled at Margaret's transformation when they met for lunch one afternoon. "You look amazing," Helen said, her voice full of admiration. "I can't believe how much you've changed in just a few months. You look like you're glowing." Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude. "It's all about balance, Helen. Moving my body, eating well, and, most importantly, making sure I rest and recover properly. I didn't realize how much I was neglecting that part of the equation." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's the secret we've been missing all along. We're so busy trying to keep up with everything that we forget to take care of ourselves in the process." Margaret couldn't agree more. As she looked around at the vibrant colors of the restaurant garden and listened to the laughter of her friends, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life was moving forward, but she no longer felt like she was constantly running after it. Instead, she was walking alongside it, mindful of her pace, attuned to her needs, and in tune with the rhythm of her own body. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, and there would be days when her energy would dip or her body would need extra care. But Margaret had learned something invaluable over the past few months. Health wasn't about perfection or pushing through fatigue. It was about understanding the intricate balance of movement, nutrition, and rest. And in that balance, Margaret had found a new freedom, a freedom to live fully with strength, vitality, and the wisdom of knowing when to push forward and when to pause. As she sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret felt grateful for the journey she had undertaken. The habits she had cultivated, movement, nourishment, rest, had become a foundation for a new chapter of her life. And as the night wrapped itself around her, she realized that her 70s weren't a time to slow down or fade away. They were a time to embrace a new kind of vitality, one that would continue to flourish as long as she kept honoring her body's needs. Margaret was learning at long last how to live her best life, not just for today, but for the years to come.